first brain is actually, your gut. Your gut's your first brain. And that's how there's so many nerve endings in your gut that, kind of make up the microbiome. And so, diving into that a little bit deeper was, the studies have shown that prebiotic, this is how the phase of the gut works.
Awekenge, this is Mental Matters, hosted by Asego Toto. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Mental Matters. I'm your host, Asego Toto, and before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's back into our conversation.
In terms of, I would say that I did a much research on the conversation as we had before, and actually I found some things. Hopefully, we're gonna dive deeply on the side of nutrition in terms of your actual personal story. I don't feel good about that, but that's okay. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, ask away. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Definitely, as you said that you dealt with insecurity and depression. What was the cause of that, and also what was the pivotal moment when you decided that you need to change some things and focus more on yourself in terms of saving your marriage?
Yeah, for sure. My story, everyone, your test is your testimony at the end of the day. And so my story originated kind of in this mindset that was shifting from a lacking mindset to an abundance mindset. And that is over the course. So that's in a journey. So when I tell you of where I was at to really where I am today from a mindset perspective, this is encompassing of, probably 20 years that I'm going to put in a nutshell here. But, it really started when I was dealing with some injuries in high school. I was a pretty good athlete. But then that transitioning piece, I considered myself a failed athlete, right? So coming out of high school, I had some JUCO offers to go play basketball at some junior colleges, but it wasn't I expected to be a Division I athlete. That was always my goal. I'm going to be a Division I athlete. And so then when I didn't get to the point of getting those offers in, and it was junior college, I'm like, dude, I'm too good for that. And so what I saw was a deterioration of a mindset. And so I'm too good, right? And that led to then in my early 20s of I'm just going to kind of take life and do what it is. So I got a job. And I did all these other things, but again, it was a deteriorating mindset. I wasn't elevating myself. I wasn't trying to grow. And I was just going through each day as if it was just the next day, right? Not the next day to get better, but just the next day. And so that even led into the way I approached my girlfriend at the time, which is now my wife. And so it wasn't to lean into her, to get to know her better, to grow in a relationship. It was this is what I have, right? And so this deteriorating mindset led to me in my 20s of I looked at what I was lacking and then thought grass was greener on the other side instead of looking at what I had directly in front of me. And so as this spawned, it came down to this point of man, I feel really empty. I don't feel fulfilled or fueled in this case. I don't feel where every human wants to feel at the end of the day. They want to feel fulfilled, I'm getting better every day. But it was a choice, right? It literally is a direct indication of the choice. And so I came from, a family that was kind of born and raised with the Christian faith and that Christian model. But I personally wasn't a Christian at that time. And I was man, if there is God. It was like, I felt like maybe one of the first times maybe in my life that I truly spoke to God. I'm like, God, like, what do you have for me? Like, is there a meaning to this? And so I just heard, go into this thing called Celebrate Recovery, which at the time, like, I was like, this is for like drug addicts. This isn't, for me. And so I went into it, and there was a group of guys, and there were some drug addicts in there. And then there was also guys struggling with their marriage. And I had literally just married my wife. And again, with this deteriorating mindset, it was like, okay, I'll just marry her to marry her. And it really pains her to this day that I had that mentality going into our marriage. But that was the first decision that I ever made at 26 years old. That was like, I am going to focus on growth here on out. Like, all the remaining of my days, like, I want to grow. Just if I get 1% better, how is that going to be? And so that one decision, I think it was a 3-month program. It was like a men's small group that we got together. And through that transition, I was just able to grow every day. And then I looked at life a little bit differently. And I started with literally one small tasks of encouraging. And so I woke up and encouraged my wife. So prayer became a discipline in my life. And then I started encouraging my wife. And so I would just encourage her on things that she maybe did, or, the way she looked, or just her being a person. And that naturally grew over time, that I'm like, man, like, I perceive you a lot differently. Our relationship is we're coming together instead of me pulling us apart. And so that is really what ultimately kind of pulled me through that, was just making one decision to say, hey, I need to be vulnerable enough to know that, like, I'm not okay. And that, how am I going to grow from here? Like, if this is the baseline, like, how am I going to grow every day? And so that was the impetus at 26 years old, that I'm like, hey, I'm going to take each day and I'm just going to grow a little bit more. And as I aforementioned to you, I got into reading, and, there's so many guys. I actually was talking to a guy the other day that he said, like, I just don't like reading. And I was like, that's not how words are so powerful. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you always say, hey, I'm just getting better at reading, right? Because when you utilize those words, then you're really moving that into reticular activating system that says, hey, I'm getting better at something. So for me, I was like, man, I hate reading. Like, I never read in high school. I barely read in my mid-20s, like through college. But then reading became a tool for me, and just empowering my mind to grow every day. And so reading really kind of reshaped and reformed that, both in scripture and in books. And then that is a culmination of really 12 years later, being my brain operating on a much different capacity, because I chose growth rather than complacency.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to touch on, in terms, I feel like at some point in our life, in terms of, we think sometimes that anything come towards us and think that there's no need for improvement. Just the way that I am now, it's a proper way. It's something that people actually value. If I don't know, I will need it sometimes. That's how I saw myself, in terms of when I had that perception back when I was listening to this podcast. I'm not editing it. People like it, in terms of when there is raw material, in terms of not editing, not actually looking at the actual content of how will this benefit people? How will this actually, in terms of, when I say benefit, how it will help them in terms when it comes to mental health. So in that sense, I understand it. And whereas people keep on saying that they should do this and this and this, I became had that ignorance of, no, I know what I'm doing. You don't know why. I've done the research. I've done everything. I know everything about podcast. Not realizing that I really need other people's perspective when it comes to these things of mental health, and people that have actually went there as well. People that have started podcasts, and the podcast, they have been successful. So I agree with you. And also, I just want to also touch on the program. One thing that I realized, the fact that when as men back in one place, you are bound by both. You are bound to actually learn from other men in terms of what actually means to be resilient, what actually means to be emotionally intelligent. One thing that I realized. And I just want to ask you this question in terms of, you mentioned the fact that you were vulnerable with your wife. And when you started being vulnerable, how did it feel? Because there's this perception when it comes to men, you shouldn't be vulnerable. You shouldn't talk about the feelings with your wife because you are girlfriend, because you want to see every week. So what's your take in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Vulnerability, I think, is a superpower for a man. We have to expose ourselves. Now, there's also there's an author, man, drawing a blank right now on her name, but she's expert in vulnerability. She comes out of the University of Texas. I've read a few of her books, and she really kind of clears up the vulnerability perspective. And I do believe that there's two lanes to this, right? You have a trusted circle, and I believe from a man to a man, there is a trusted circle where like you can come to them and kind of exploit some, a little bit of vulnerability that maybe your wife shouldn't know at the end of the day, because of what an impact that it might do on the relationship. But then there's this piece of like, you can be vulnerable to your wife. And I'll put it in kind of like a twofold perspective. When you're in a man to a man circle and you can be vulnerable, that superpower. Like if you don't want to generally expose it. Now for me, I'm an open book. Like I pretty much say whatever now at this point, because I think I have a level of confidence and speak with a level of authority that it allows me to do that. I've kind of shifted past that phrase of like, I can be a little bit more publicly open about some of the things that kind of happened in my past and how I've grown from that. But for most men, I'm speaking generalized for most men, right? I think it's identifying like that circle, that trusted circle, which a lot of men don't have, right? I think it's really, really important to get a trusted circle. For us in like Full Field, we have a board of advisors. So like anytime it's something that I need to pray through or anything, I don't need to weight that on my wife. Like maybe if it's a business decision, I go to my board of advisors and I got 3 guys that I can ring up and I can be like, hey, can you pray through this with me? So I think that's really, really crucial in like my development of getting it off of me. And that being vulnerable to the fact that like sometimes you don't know the answer and your wife shouldn't hold on to that, or your girlfriend or whoever it might be. Now, the other piece is and a level of vulnerability as a man, because I believe in this alpha concept, right? A man is extremely powerful and I have power and authority over me. However, I can let my wife lead. And so one of the cool things that I've like been able to see like in the dynamic of my relationship is that I know when that I need to pull that lever and I need to lead really well. And a level of vulnerability says to me, hey, how about you lead in this situation? Right. And when you can get and develop that in your relationship and say, hey, I'm going to lead here, or I'm going to elevate you and you lead in that capacity, because there's roles within our household that she leads, right? And that I lead. And so we can have this a tandem effect, but the reality is in like marriage is that majority of the time your wife's going to come back to you and you need to make a strong decision. And so what men are lacking in like our society alone right now is that they have an inability to make really strong decisions and they defer things like to their wife a lot in the household, in whatever is going on. But like, if you know that like you can come with the intention of vulnerability and that confidence, communication is everything. I can elevate my wife and still be the man of the household, the alpha male in the household, right? Because there is a level of dominance and power that I still hold, but I don't utilize that as a dictatorship type power, right? That alpha power. It's definitely a democratized power where I am coming in and I'm saying, hey, how about you lead in this situation? And I'm empowering her in that way. And that's really what I've learned from, my loneliest state to where I am now, is that I can let her lead in situations. So you can let a woman lead. I think there's definitely so many powerful attributes that women have. But it's in the man to identify that in the woman and elevate them in that capacity.
And you spoke about in terms of the skills. Actually, we go into the conversation around men's community in terms of being in a strong community. And something that I've realized and also realized about myself is the fact that when I started having that strong relationship with my friends, I had this actually conversation with myself in terms of, is it this group that would I trust them with some type of thing in terms of having those conversations? Can those conversations lead to something in terms of not trusting your friends as much as actually you have been friends with them for the longest time? And would self-doubt really play a role in terms of finding the right friends, or it actually terminate a good thing when it comes to those strong connection with men.
Yeah, another good strong point that you bring up. And the reality is as you grow, your friends will fall off. So, so many people want to hold on to their friends that, they might have had since high school and I still talk to a lot of, friends